All right. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope the lunch was nice and fulfilling and you have strength to be with us for this session and the next one and take part in these discussions and enjoy this event. So I'm Associate Professor Juha Kukkola from the Russia Research Group, and I will be the moderator of this session, number 11, on future prospects. And in this session, we have three very interesting presentations examining how Russia's war on Ukraine might end and what factors might affect its continuation and also Russia's future prospects. In this session, each presenter will have approximately 20 minutes to present his or her research, and after each presentation, I will give you, the audience, a chance to ask questions, a couple of questions before we go to the next presentation. So there isn't going to be a panel at the end of this session, but we will have in the last session a big panel where you can ask all the questions that are left unasked during this session. So I would ask every presenter to stick his or her allotted time, which was the approximately 20 minutes, and we will have a hard stop 1:30 so that everybody can enjoy their coffee before the last session. And without further ado, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our first presenter, Dr. Bernard Finel. Dr. Finel, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Excellent, sir, and thank you for joining us. I will shortly introduce to the audience and then give the floor to you. So, Dr. Bernard Finel is the current Dean of the College of International and Security Studies at the George C. Marshall European Center for Security Studies. Before joining the Marshall Center team, Dr. Finel was faculty at the U.S. National War College in Washington from 2010 to 2024, where he served as a course director, chair of the Department of Security Studies, and associate dean of academic programs. Dr. Finel has a long and distinguished career in strategic and security studies. His areas of expertise include strategic competition, terrorism and irregular warfare, use of force and military history. Dr. Finel has published widely on international politics and security. He is the co-author and co-editor of Power and Conflict in the Age of Transparency and Ultimate Security, Combating Weapons of Mass Destruction. His research has been published in the journals Security Studies, International Security, Aerospace Power Journal, International Studies Quarterly, National Security Studies Quarterly, Armed Forces Journal, and World Affairs. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the very kind introduction. And let me first express my apologies for not being able to be there in person. As I suspect you know, the U.S. government is going through a number of changes recently, and it's made some travel difficult and raised a number of crises that I had to deal with back at home. So let me sort of segue from that to give great thanks to the Finnish National Defense University and to all of you for being in attendance and for letting me speak a little bit about some thoughts about the future of the Russian war of aggression in Ukraine. Let me note that I speak purely on behalf of myself as an analyst. I'm not speaking on behalf of the Marshall Center, U.S. Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. As it might become clear in the next 20 minutes or so. Next slide, please. So I want to lay out some of my biases up front and a little bit about how I came into this project. I think that we're still, in many ways, even 3 years into this, a bit taken aback by the Russian attack on Ukraine. And I still find that in a lot of discussions with colleagues and with various participants and interlocutors, that there's still sort of a sense that, well, this is just one of those things that happens, as opposed to a really fundamentally transformational event, one that really calls into question the foundational principle of international law since at least the end of World War II, which is that you can't invade your neighbors and take their territory. And I don't think that we've in some ways quite grasped the urgency of this situation and the normative consequences of allowing the aggression to remain unmet and unreversed. So as I talk through this, I want to make clear where my biases lay. They are very much against the Russian war and the Russian attack and the legitimacy of it. And I think that as much as there are many people who talk about the importance of finding an end, a war termination, because of the human cost associated with the war, that has to be balanced against the cost of the wrong kind of a termination of the conflict. I think that there's a real risk of prioritizing ending the conflict, finding a way to get to a ceasefire over what this all means for the international legal system, for norms, for the future of Ukraine as well, and the future of Europe more broadly, I'd say. Slide, please. So I come at this from an academic background. That's where my formal training is as a political scientist. And I've always been interested in this nexus, this bridging the gap between policy and academia, and trying to find ways in which to inform policy debates through the use of academic theory. And from my perspective, this was important because I think that much of the analysis that we see of the conflict is at two levels. At one level, it's a very sort of high, sort of strategic level, talking about sort of big picture, broad consequences, and so on, and should the war be ended or not, and under what terms and when. And then you have a great deal of absolutely superb, brilliant analysis of the tactical and operational developments. So very nuanced, very not, I won't say in the weeds, but very detailed, very rich in nuance. And I think there's what's missing is this intermediate level of sort of the how, right? How do you get to war termination in a conflict like we're dealing with in Ukraine? And so I looked through the academic literature and found basically 4 lines of argumentation which talked towards this issue of war termination under what are the mechanisms by which wars might terminate, and of course, what are the consequences for potentially the range of outcomes which are plausible. And those 4 are basically the very straightforward notion of a military victory. Is military victory possible in Ukraine? I'll talk through some of that on the future slides. Then there's all the rationalist theories about war. As you know, James Fearon, Danny Reiter, others, Jeffrey Blaney originally, comes to the notion of war as an information gap, right? That essentially, if you knew how the war is going to turn out, you would make the commitments beforehand, whatever concessions were needed beforehand, and not pay the cost of the war. And so therefore, war by its very nature must be about incomplete information or debated information. And that war clarifies that information. I want to talk about that and how this is applying or playing out in this conflict. A third approach refocuses on this notion of coercion, and this builds on the work of Thomas Schelling and others who really were thinking about, well, how do you turn force and the threat of force into political outcomes? And again, this is about cost and position. And we want to talk further about the logic of cost and position. How does cost and position play out in terms of the conflict that we're seeing? And finally, there's an entire body of literature building on Bill Zartman and others about the conditions under which conflicts can be settled through negotiation, often grounded around this concept of a mutually hurting stalemate, MHS, as they sometimes summarize it. And what happens then? What are the negotiation dynamics under those kind of conditions? I want to talk about those as well. So I plan to go through each 4 of these relatively quickly. Obviously, I'm drawing upon a huge body of literature, and I'm summarizing it in ways that anybody who is a scholar or expert in any one of these areas will maybe find insufficient. In much the same way as the empirical evidence I present may also seem thin to people who are experts and very steeped in the tactical and operational details of what's going on a day-to-day basis. And that's really one of the challenges, right, between using academic theory to inform policy debates, is that you're operating in a gap where you're not theoretical enough in some ways for the academics, and in some ways you're not practical enough for the practitioners. I hope I'm able to bridge that gap to a certain extent and make some interesting points, at least points that you will find interesting, and maybe the source of some good debate going forward. Next slide, please. So if we think about military victory, there's basically two mechanisms that we usually think about, the logic of annihilation versus attrition. There's also sort of exhaustion, which is a sort of form of annihilation, of attrition. But these two logics operate in different manners. The manner in which annihilation operates refocus on the notion of decisive battle or battles, decisive campaigns, in which by virtue of the military operations, one or the other side loses the ability to continue to fight. Its forces become disconnected from each other, supply no longer is possible, morale collapses, the forces disintegrate, and essentially a relatively rapid victory occurs. This is the classic blitzkrieg from World War II, but it's also what we've seen in various conflicts, even in the modern era. It's rare that we've seen these kind of protracted conventional conflicts. In fact, they've ended quite quickly in the past. Even when they've had relatively long-term strategically indecisive outcomes, the military portion of the campaign, you think about the U.S. invasion of Iraq, for example, either in 1990 or in 1981 or 2003, as examples of some of these decisive campaigns, right? Even though the long-term consequences weren't decisive in any way, but the campaigns themselves were. It's hard to think about that occurring in the case of Ukraine, because I think what we've seen is over the past decade or two, and maybe even just the past half decade, a tremendous change in the nature of the lethality of the battlefield. And in particular, with the use of persistent surveillance, unmanned systems, all the drones, a great deal of artillery. What we're seeing is in some ways a surprising level of stalemate, because the forces that are manning this 1,000-kilometer front are not that large. I mean, they're large, don't get me wrong, compared to the standing forces of most Western European countries at this point, but they're not large by historic standards of what it takes to man a 1,000-kilometer front. There maybe the force-to-space ratios are, for example, maybe 1/5 to 1/10 what they were in the Western Front in World War I. And also the depth of the deployments are relatively limited. You're not talking about second, third, fourth, well-defended lines, fallback positions, and so on. It's a relatively thin front line with a relatively dispersed rear lines, and that would be conducive under traditional interpretations of annihilation warfare for breakthrough and exploitation. That doesn't seem to be possible. It doesn't seem to be possible in part because of a limited ability at operational art, I would argue. But even more so, I think it's fundamentally about the lethality of the battlefield and what we might call virtual density, right? The ability to impose tremendous amounts of costs the moment that anybody pokes their heads up out of a cover. And concealment itself is becoming more and more difficult with a fusion of sensors, LiDAR and radar and infrared and so on, which means that the moment you come out of cover, you are vulnerable. Okay, so I don't see a mechanism going forward for a decisive victory occurring through some sort of sudden military breakthrough, simply because of the nature of the contemporary battlefield, which is much more, I think, defensive dominant than anybody who's an analyst of military affairs would have predicted, even as recently as 5 or 10 years ago. We thought that would be much more of a high-tech, quick, rapid-moving war where it'd be possible to have decisive effects through a fusion of multiple capabilities. Instead, what we have is a very traditional-looking blood and guts kind of conflict, blood and mud kind of conflict. Okay, on the flip side, the other way in which these wars are often won is through attrition, where basically one side or the other is able to bleed the other side white. And this is very much, I think, the Russian strategy at this point. It's a Verdun strategy from World War I. The goal is to throw forces into the meat grinder on the assumption that you'll be able to impose significant enough costs on the Ukrainians to bleed them white. And here, it's problematic for a couple of reasons. Obviously, it's problematic for the individuals who are caught in the mix of this. But it's hard to see how this actually plays out as a successful attritional strategy for a couple of reasons. One, clearly the loss exchange ratios are in favor of the Russians. Now, I'm sorry, in favor of the Ukrainians. We don't know quite how much. The data is poor. It's ranging from somewhere, the estimates are going to be about 6 to 5, so 6 Russians lost for every 5 Ukrainians lost, to 3 to 2, to maybe even 2 to 1 if we're looking purely at killed in action or permanently removed from the battlefield. So that's actually a loss exchange ratio, which is quite good for Ukrainians on an individual level. But of course, because the population of Russia is 4 times that of Ukraine's, they have a much larger pool. But by same token, this isn't sufficiently large to be able to see a relatively rapid end in terms of the Ukrainians losing their capacity to resist, because despite the losses that are being inflicted upon the Ukrainians, they seem to be able to make up for those losses. And there are a couple of reasons why. One of which is that there's a perverse dynamic about demographics in these kind of conflicts. And as you all know, in both Russia and Ukraine, in the immediate aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a real collapse of birth, of children being born. That recovered reasonably significantly into the early 2000s. And so both Russia and Ukraine actually have a bit of a baby boom coming up. So for the next 10 years or so, actually, and then the population rates declined again, but there's about a 10-year baby boom that's going to sustain the ability to replenish forces on both sides, unfortunately, which means that there's sort of a grim demographic reality that attrition is probably not going to be successful. The other part of this is that the Russians aren't able to impose a sufficiently high op tempo upon the Ukrainians to make even that the imbalances that they have decisive. And the reason for that is, I think, because the Russians lack sufficient logistical capacity on one hand, and again, because at some point the battlefield is so lethal, you can't be able to really concentrate forces in a way that would allow you to do the full Verdun kind of strategy. You're doing it at the margins because of the nature of the battlefield, the nature of the logistical trade, the nature of the battlefield that limits the concentration of forces. So neither side, I'd say, seems at risk of imminent collapse due to attrition, and decisive victory seems unlikely as well. So I think in this case, there is no real pathway to war termination that flows through the logic of military victory. And I'll come back to that a little bit towards the end. Next slide, please. Okay, on this one, this is really fascinating because clearly there was an information asymmetry which caused the conflict to occur in the first place. The Russians seem to have been convinced that they would have the ability for a rapid decapitation strike on the Ukrainians. Ukraine government would collapse. Ukraine resistance would fade relatively quickly. And this is the basis of the famous 3 days prediction, which fell apart almost immediately. Now, what's interesting is that the academic theorists, people like Jim Fearon and others, would say, well, that should have led to a recalculation on the Russian side. Once they realized that the initial information under which they'd entered into the conflict was wrong, they should have changed their war aims, and their war aims should become more limited. And there's no actual evidence of that at this point, which is really a problem for the rationalist information theorists of war, because that is their fundamental proposition about the nature of what war is about. The war is about clarifying expectations. And what's interesting to me is, well, why do we think that occurred? Why do we think that the new information hasn't been processed in ways that have changed war aims in Russia fundamentally? And we can debate whether we think they have or not, and I'm happy to do that in part of the question and answer or part of the panel discussion. But why is that the case? Well, there's a number of explanations which have been brooded about. One is that Putin is so isolated from the real source of information that he's not getting true information. So he's not able to reassess because he's not actually being given the information to reassess. I don't buy that. I might have bought that in the first few months of the war, but now it's been 3 years. And even if Putin's being fed misleading information, he has to know, right, that the initial goal of rapid collapse of Ukraine was false. So the silo, the bubble of information doesn't make sense to me. There's a couple of other possibilities. One is that Putin and the Russians more generally feel trapped by the blowback of their own rhetoric. by referring to the Ukrainians as Nazis over and over again, and talking about denazification. At that point, it becomes very hard to ever stop, right? You can never say, well, okay, this is going to be harder than we thought. That's fine, because if you've defined the struggle as existential against a Nazi force on your border, well, then you're not going to ever recalibrate your decisions because you see it as existential. Which maybe, do the Russians really believe their own rhetoric? Do they feel trapped by public opinion generated by that rhetoric? It seems hard to square with the nature of the Russian political system and their control of information. Instead, I think what we've seen is really something interesting, and I think which causes a real challenge to the informational theories of war, is that every time the Russian theory of war, right, the initial decapitation, later on, bleeding the Ukrainians white and attrition, the collapse of domestic Ukraine support, and then the notion that maybe the West's willpower would collapse. All of these are shifting rationale, shifting theories of victory, and for each one, it has its own set of ambiguities built into it. And what's interesting is that every time the information clarifies that theory of victory A is false, they shift to theory of victory B. And once that clarifies being false, they go to C and then to D. And that is not a dynamic which the informational theorists of war have captured. And I think what the issue is more fundamental, is that war creates these kind of lock-in dynamics, blood cost, sunk cost fallacies. We might call them fallacies, but they are politically real. And at some point, you end up just looking for possible alternative rationales. I think that's what's happened here. Okay, please, next slide. Cost and position strategies. Here, the question is, well, can you ever impose sufficient costs on the other side to make them say it's not worth it to continue? And that can be on the battlefield, certainly through the attritional logic, but can also be through direct attacks on a country's society, infrastructure, and so on. And that's been also another theory of victory which the Russians have taken on, that they could essentially break the will of the Ukrainians by destroying heating infrastructure, power infrastructure, and so on. That hasn't really worked so far. Ukrainian public opinion seems relatively steady in terms of supporting ongoing operations, although there is a significant desire for some sort of negotiations, but they would have to be, I think, on reasonable terms. Here is an asymmetry, though, or at least there has been until very recently. The Ukrainians were very much constrained by the Western allies and the limitations on their own capabilities from striking deep into Russia. And so the cost and position was very symmetric. We might see a change here as more and more targeting inside Russia occurs, as more of Russia's energy infrastructure becomes disabled, their oil infrastructure in particular. We may see changes, but we don't know. We're not quite there yet. What's been clear is that it hasn't had sufficient effect on the Ukraine side. And why is that? Well, I expect ultimately, as it comes to, I'll talk about this on the next section as well. For Ukraine, the war is existential. It's not just existential in a sort of broadly rhetorical sense, that there's invented Nazis on the other side, but because the Russians have actually said that they're going. They are just Russians with funny accent, and that makes it very difficult for Ukraine ever to concede. Okay, let me go to the next slide on bargaining dynamics. I think what this all speaks to is that even though both sides are hurting, neither side sees sort of a path. Both sides see pathways to victory still. And so even though they're mutually hurting, they're not hurting enough, A, and B, I don't think the Russians in particular are convinced that they're at a stalemate. They think that they still have some potential gains to go. But let me take a step back and just talk about the negotiation dynamics for a moment. One thing that's problematic and that makes negotiations difficult is that the entire negotiation space is really focused on Ukrainian concessions. Will Ukraine concede to not join NATO? Will they concede not to join the EU? Will they concede Russian territorial gains that have been made? And there's an asymmetry because there's no trade-offs. That's why the Kursk offensive was so important, of course. That's a tiny sliver of land, and the Ukrainians probably won't be able to hold that much into 2025, or if they do, it'll be much diminished. And here's a place where the negotiation dynamics become very problematic, because if you don't have good trades to make, then what are you bargaining over? You're actually just bargaining over the terms of your surrender. And we're not at the point where the Ukrainians are, because they haven't been defeated yet, because they're not being coerced sufficiently to give up. They're not at the point where they can where they're willing to make concessions, which are fundamentally going to undermine the future viability of the country. And so the only way we can get to a bargaining position is if the Ukrainian position becomes actually much more expansive. If the Ukrainians actually begin to ask for a lot more so they can back off on some of their asks, in return get the Russians to back off from some of their asks, because right now, as I say, the entire negotiation space is over Ukrainian concessions, and that's not liable to be successful to end the war, given the fact that the Russians haven't been able to force essentially Ukrainians to surrender. Next slide, please. All right, so let me just summarize and give just a couple of policy recommendations. I know I'm over time by a couple of minutes, but I'll be very quick. I don't think that there's any clear pathway to a war termination at this point. Russia's winning the war, we might say, but very, very slowly. And really, it might be over a period of decades at the current pace of operations. And if that's the case, then really what we're talking about when we're talking about war termination is a hope that someone will choose to end the conflict, as opposed to a mechanism that's going to actually force either side to end the conflict. Next slide, please. So let me just talk about, really briefly, a few policy recommendations. The first is, I think the Ukrainians have to find a way to make that lost exchange ratio, to make the Russians pay more for every Ukrainian life than they have so far. I think Ukraine's been very brave, and I understand the logic and the morale implications of holding the line at every point and making the Russians pay for every inch with as much blood as possible. But the costs on the Ukraine side are very high. And one thing Ukraine has is a relatively large territory. And I think that at some point, the Ukrainians need to think about doing more trading of space for time. Some pulling back, not holding the line quite strongly, but imposing costs on the Russians. They might be less costs for every inch, but they might have more inches to give up or more meters to give up of territory, which might impose more costs over time. Second, they need to increase their deep strike operations in Russia. And here, I think the main argument against that is the threat of escalation, which I think, again, is self-deterrence on the wet part of the West. There's no logical reason why we should fear Russian escalation more than we should fear any other escalation. They have nukes. We have nukes in the West. And that should be a strategically stable deterrence. And we should be seeing the ability to escalate beneath the nuclear threshold, not as necessarily risking a jump to nuclear threshold. And finally, look, I mean, I know this is preaching maybe to the choir. It'd be great to see greater Western support. I hope it comes from Europe. I think it's not going to come from the United States at this point, but there needs to be a plan for sustainable long-term support so that the Ukrainians ultimately don't feel that they've been left twisting in the wind. So anyway, I'll stop there. I've gone on long enough. I appreciate your attention. I look forward to discussion both right now, if you have any questions, or during the panel. And let me pause here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Finnell, for a very, very interesting presentation. In order to keep on time, I will allow one question at this point from the audience. Anyone? None? No takers? All right. Dr. Finnell will be with us in the panel after this, so you get to think about your questions and ask them then. So let's continue to our next speaker. It is Jonna Alava. Jonna Alava is a doctoral researcher at the University of Helsinki and has been a member of our Russia research group at the National Defense University since August 2019. Her forthcoming article-based dissertation examines military patriotic education in Russia, and that's a dissertation that we are anxiously waiting to get our hands on. So, Jonna, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Juha, for introduction. So, over the past 5 years, I have been working on my dissertation on military patriotic education in Russia. And as the project is finally coming to an end, I'm pleased to share some key findings with you today. The dissertation explores especially the meanings of military patriotic education, how the Kremlin defines and legitimizes it, how people make sense of it, how they express resistance, and what is the role of gender in Russian militarization. While the 3 articles take very different approaches to the topic, the unifying thread across the studies was the use of discourse analysis and sociological theories, for example, feminist perspectives and Michel Foucault's ideas on use of power and governmentality. Let's start with some basic facts about military patriotic education. It has a long history, and during the Soviet era, the entire nation participated in it, most commonly through organizations such as Komsomol, DOSAAF, or Ready for Labor and Defense Training System. Schools also had lessons on the theme. This is a memory now that current leaders now romanticize, considering it as a great system for uniting the nation. Today's military patriotic education is guided by 5-year federal patriotic education programs, which have been in place since Putin's first term in 2001. Patriotic organizations are integrated into all major institutions and ministries, making it fundamentally different from, for example, the Nazi movement 20 years ago, which quickly disappeared when its leaders lost power. Since the onset of the war, we can speak of a paradigm shift in patriotic education. Its scale has expanded, it openly praises Putin and collaborates with United Russia, and education has become increasingly militarized. I suggest viewing Russian state patriotism more as an indoctrination today than as a distinct project. Patriotic education is an ever-evolving system, perhaps even an industry, so vast that it is impossible to track in detail. With a massive budget equivalent to the annual budget of Moscow, it attracts a wide range of actors and businessmen, and corruption scandals are not uncommon. I argue that this money-making machine often leads to patriotic initiatives that may fulfill the external markers of patriotic education, but their content is often hollow and has little to do with the genuine education of children and youth. The goal is for every Russian minor to become a member of patriotic organization, much like in the Pioneer and Komsomol organizations of the Soviet era. This has not been fully realized yet, but all children receive now a lot of patriotic education in schools. Nowadays, young people who have been members of patriotic organizations can receive increased stipends at higher educational institutions. I am certain that in the near future, these benefits expand to cover many state institutions. At the same time, education is also used as a punishment. For example, misbehaving children who have committed crimes can be officially sent to military patriotic camps. Broadly speaking, patriotic education as a concept refers to the spiritual aspect, instilling love for the motherland and so on, while military patriotic education focuses on the practical side, teaching military skills to children. However, I argue that this distinction has blurred since the onset of the war, as the entire system has been mobilized to support the war efforts in many ways. At the same time, the concept of patriotism has shifted, leaving no room for a pacifist interpretation. The lesson on legitimation is based on my article, Russia's Young Army, Raising New Generations into Militarized Patriots, which examines the military patriotic movement Yun Armia. With nearly 2 million members, Junarmia serves as a flagship for what militarized patriotism should be. Its purpose is twofold. First, to shape a new generation of citizens with the right values, and second, to cultivate healthy boys who are willing to join the army. The organization is hoped to be a good weapon against color revolutions. Junarmia was established in 2015 and legitimized by framing military patriotic education as a long-standing tradition in Russia, where the absence of programs in the 90s was just a shameful exception. Military discipline is presented as a strong foundation for educating and raising children. Enemy images play a central role in Junarmia's communication, where NATO, the West, and the globalization are depicted as threats seeking to corrupt Russia's younger generation. For parents, however, and potential members, Junarmia is marketed as a fun hobby. And if you read Junarmia's own materials, they rarely mention any weapons or military training, which is in turn in stark contrast to the warlike images. When analyzing legitimation debates, it became clear that children's and youth's voices were marginalized, as were those of pedagogues who could have provided insights into the potential effects of military training for young children. Pacifism is something which is not tolerated. Yet, the Junarmia and militarization of children has been quite easily accepted in Russian society. Perhaps because militarism itself is not fully recognized. Russia has a long tradition of a defensive mindset, while militarism as a concept is something that exists only in the West. I argue that during the war, Junarmia's role has shifted further from citizenship education toward producing soldiers. There are strong indications that Junarmia members face intense pressure to join the army, and many former members have already died. Junarmia is also one of the main actors organizing re-education camps in occupied areas for Ukrainians, which has led to sanctions against the organization. However, in patriotic education, somewhere else in Russia, these Junarmia's activities are framed as altruistic. They're just helping these children adapt to their real homeland. The question of why there are so many girls in Junarmia led me to study women soldiers in the Russian armed forces. I wanted to know, is the role of women changing in Russian warfare, and are there plans to increase the number of female soldiers? Now I can say that no. A couple of years ago, there were 40,000 female contract soldiers and 300,000 female civilian personnel in the Russian armed forces. Currently, the number of women is actually decreasing, and I see there are two main reasons. Firstly, the gendered legitimation of the war, and secondly, the more important task for Russian women at the moment, motherhood. Despite Russian military leaders often claiming that women can achieve any position in the armed forces, in reality, significant obstacles remain to women's integration. These include, for example, restrictions in military academies and forbidden jobs for women, which are justified as measures to protect women's reproductive health. There are also challenges in advancing to higher positions, as women cannot use their conscription service time to further their careers, and they must retire earlier than men. On the other side of the coin are societal attitudes that perceive women as less capable and intelligent than men. Ultimately, most of the women soldiers end up in supporting positions in the army. In my article, I analyzed representations of female soldiers from the military reform of the millennium to the present in the Russian armed forces newspaper Krasnaya Zvezda, and found that the hegemonic portrayal of modern female soldier is rooted in the traditional archetype of Rodina Maat, a sacred symbol of Russia, which can be translated as the motherland or Mother Russia. Here in the picture is the statue of Rodina Maat in Volgograd. There is also a similar statue, for example, in Kiev. So why is Rodina Maat used as the ideal for women soldiers? It depicts women as mothers, supporters of men, and protectors of the home front. While reading stories about female soldiers, I found it striking how their children and husbands were always mentioned. The most important patriotic duty for women, even as soldiers, is motherhood, which signifies that they are not needed for combat today. The figure of Rodina Maat is used to legitimize women's supporting roles and routine tasks. This portrayal reinforces stereotypes and reflects the patriarchal and traditionalist discourses of the state ideology. In recent years, the use of Rodina Maat has only strengthened. There are also other portrayals of female soldiers that either support or challenge the Rodina Maat. The most common discourse is the so-called handmaiden, a sexually attractive woman who serves usually as a nurse or radio operator. This portrayal is often used to promote a modern image of the armed forces, projecting a gender equality, while at the same time emphasizing sexual attractiveness of women. I argue that this type of female soldier is exactly what the armed forces need today, because it is believed that femininity of women soldiers indeed enhances men's morale and in turn impacts the overall military effectiveness. The portrayal of female martyrs has not yet been used in the same way as during the Second World War, when the press highlighted fallen women soldiers to inspire and motivate men. However, there are signs that female martyrs are becoming more prominent. For example, new statues and museums dedicated to Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya, the most famous martyr of the Great Patriotic War, has been established in recent years. The third portrayal, the female warrior, emerges when the women soldiers are able to tell their own stories. Stories suggest that many female soldiers are emancipated and liberated, calling for equal treatment and presenting themselves primarily as professionals, not defined by gender. This may explain why this portrayal remains marginalized. In short, authorities regulate women's roles in wartime labor by attaching different meanings to media representations of women. An analysis of these portrayals sheds light on why Russian female soldiers are so invisible compared to their Ukrainian counterparts. I do not believe that women face serious mobilization in Russia, as the Kremlin has weaponized gender as part of its war legitimation. In this framework, Russia, with its traditional gender roles, fights against the degenerated West. If Putin wanted to mobilize women, perhaps he could notice what Stalin did before the Second World War. He liberated gender roles completely, which created space and motivation for women to take up arms. However, today's ideological structures in Russia could hardly support such a shift. Before the war, patriotic education was mostly voluntary outside school hours. This changed rapidly after the onset of the war. Educational institutions, from kindergartens to universities, faced new patriotic initiatives, of which implementation was strictly controlled. Here comes a lot of examples. Nowadays, Monday mornings in Russian schools begin with the flag raising and national anthem, followed by a nude propaganda lesson, Important Conversation, which promotes the Kremlin's worldview, ranging from traditional values to the notion of Russia as besieged fortress. At the center of it all is the war and the effort to mobilize the younger generation to support it. Last year, schools introduced new subjects such as family studies and spiritual and moral culture of Russia, the latter led by Patriarch Kirill. Military training has also returned. For 10th and 11th grade students, it is also altogether 140 hours, that is about 4 hours per week. School uniforms became mandatory for the first time since the Soviet Union, and history textbooks have been rewritten. Education on and the production of drones are planned to be part of every school's curriculum by 2030, beginning in the first grade. State-trained advisors now operate in every school, organizing patriotic activities and warning students about the dangers of protests. Opposition media suspect that these advisors also monitor and report on teachers and students. 3 years ago, new youth organization, the Movement of the Firsts, was established as an umbrella organization for all state-affiliated youth groups, aiming to function as a modern-day Komsomol and reach all 18 million underage citizens. Needless to say, its activities serve the Kremlin's new ideological goals, and children also participate in practical efforts to support the war. Beyond these official initiatives, much more is happening under the banner of patriotic education. Children are compelled to write letters to soldiers, and schools use hashtags like "We are not ashamed," "I'm proud of Russia," and "For Putin" in their communications. Militarized concerts and memorial boards honoring fallen Russian soldiers have become routine. Collaboration between schools and military and security organizations has intensified. State army, private military companies, OMON, the Cossack Society, and National Guard visit schools to explain the goals of special military operation and present themselves as employers. Priests console children whose fathers have been deployed. Fundraising for the war, both monetary and material, has become a daily practice. In some schools, 10% of teachers' salaries are automatically deducted for war support. Vocational schools produce uniforms and drones for the front lines. Teachers have been forced to distribute mobilization bonuses, and students' deferrals for military service have been revoked, leading to earlier conscriptions. In some cases, school directors have been required to point employers they are willing to send to the front. Empty lists were not an option. To sum up, Russian schools are deeply in the war. How did this happen? The answer is that patriotism has become a coerced norm, making resistance dangerous. Hundreds of teachers have been fired. The FSB visits schools to arrest teachers and students, and many have received significant fines for anti-war positions. In response, schools have begun organizing additional patriotic activities to appease higher authorities, believing this will protect them. Control has intensified. Video cameras have been installed in classrooms to monitor suspicious teachers. Students are asked to fill opinion polls probing their stance on Putin and the war. Many teachers are required to use apps to track students' social media activity, even outside school hours, and often without parental knowledge. Denunciations have become a new phenomenon in schools. Voluntarism of patriotism, patriotism is basically voluntary by law, but it is circumvented by embedding patriotic acts within mandatory lessons, and students are warned that refusal to participate could result in bad grades or difficulties entering universities. Educational materials for propaganda lessons are often distributed verbally or through WhatsApp with no clear indication of their origin. Okay, that was a long introduction to my arguments. In my dissertation, I argue that these informal campaigns and modes of implementation play a greater role in patriotic education than previously recognized. Before the war, many studies focused on individual opinions about patriotism, often concluding that patriotic education had not been effective. However, these studies failed to account the ritualistic support the system generates. Rather than fostering genuine patriotism, it cultivates ritualistic obedience. State patriotism functions as a system of governance and control through which the state legitimizes repression, and this has proven effective. On the other hand, patriotic education remains ineffective in many ways. The propaganda relies on outdated Soviet discourses and methods that even self-identified patriots find extremely boring. Moreover, if teachers are not compensated for teaching these lessons, their interest quickly fades, which tells a lot. Regional differences and variations in implementations lead to an uneven understanding of patriotism across Russia, which is hardly in the Kremlin's interest. Resistance also exists at every level. Though it is not necessarily anti-Putin or anti-war, rather it reflects a broader pushback against state interference in individuals' lives. While Russian youth appear quite politically apathetic and conformist, they are also deeply frustrated by the state efforts and express their discontent through small acts. At the same time, the coercive implementation has generated fear, contributing to societal atomization. The divide between public and private spheres is widening, and Soviet-styled doublethink is becoming an everyday life. When the younger generation begins to keep this kind of life as normal, I see little foundation for democratic development. Yet, there is also a seed of hope. This atomization and the hiding of opinions leave everyone equally blind, including the Kremlin, which cannot recognize revolutionary thresholds anymore. When space for dissent begins to open somewhere for some reason, it may trigger a snowball effect, making hidden opinions visible. This is what happened in the Soviet Union, and it could happen again. Lastly, a few thoughts on the future. I believe that if Putinism continues after Putin, this patriotic system is unlikely to disappear. Instead, they will become embedded in the Silovic structures, shaping the upbringing of a new elite. We also see a growing emphasis on political indoctrination within the armed forces, reinforcing the development of authoritarian army. A key question is how the military will address its human factors, which have been its weakest link in the war against Ukraine. Can the armed forces develop ahead of broader society and produce independent and creative troops, which was an aspiration in the last military reform? Current trends suggest otherwise. The prevailing societal order, where patriotism serves as a framework for governance, self-sacrifice is a central value. The Orthodox Church wields significant influence, and education relies on backward-looking traditional values and Soviet methods. It indicates that the cannon fodder army will remain a core feature of armed forces' human management system. At the same time, the system of military patriotic education will undoubtedly enhance certain skills, both quantitatively and qualitatively, contributing to the country's total defense, in which every citizen has a role. However, this construction remains fragile. I believe one pressing challenge for the Kremlin is managing the rising violence within society. Violence fueled by regional inequalities, military culture, toxic masculinity, demobilization, the weakening status of women, militarized education, and the Kremlin's this whole system of governance and so on. So these cultural factors at the intersection of the armed forces and society will remain central to my research beyond my dissertation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonna, for very interesting, little depressing presentation. So we have time for a couple of questions. Jonna will not take part in the panel afterwards, so if you have any questions for her, please ask them now. First one is there.
And you can send me your email.
Thank you very much. I'm pretty confident that this is included in your dissertation, but I would like to ask you to elaborate a little bit about Cadets Corps movement in Russia, also introduction of historical patriotic discussions and in the primarily military training as a subject in the secondary schools. Also to tell a little bit more about avant-garde club system established in the Russian armed forces and devoted to increase this military patriotic education. And of course, it would be very interesting to hear your thoughts about reestablishment of military chaplains and involvement of chaplains in the society life. Thank you.
Okay, there was a lot of points. Cadet Corps, I didn't look that much on them, on my dissertation, but I keep them, they are part of this military patriotic system, but maybe more professional, like structured than all these others. And about the avant-garde, I think all these, there's a, like, for example, Patriotic Center in Crimea, Artek, and then there's these avant-garde centers and Park Patriotti and things like that. I don't know, is there anything special about like avant-garde than these other places? They are part of the same system, but they produce and give resources. They are place of resources to keep patriotic camps for children. And what was the last? Well, okay. Yeah, they actually do a lot of work in Jun Armia especially. And when new Jun Armian members, they are they are baptized by like military priests when they entering Jun Armia. And I don't know, maybe these same priests like visit schools at the moment. But there is military patriotic education also in the armed forces, and what I know, the role of Orthodox Church and role of priests in army is also increasing at the moment. Thank you.
Okay, and one more. The front.
It's just the point I missed. You said something about, are you either skeptical about the possibility of re-democratization of this group or not? Because you said it in a sentence that I didn't fully understand. And if I could just ask you to sort of comment on the Hitlerjugend, for instance, right? The legacy of the Hitlerjugend was very mixed in Germany, but it did prove possible through heavy campaigns of denazification. So it doesn't seem to have had an indelible impact on Germans' re-democratization. So how do you feel about the possibility of, it's sort of a bridge to the next panel too, right, the future. How badly has Russia been hurt by all these phenomena?
Yeah, good questions, thank you. About the democratic development, I am not very optimistic because it's not that this new generation will be totally like brainwashed and militarized, but I mean like when they learn to behave in society, like in the Soviet Union, like there's a public space and there's a kitchen, and this is normal, and we can live like this, and this. So when they learn that, so it's maybe really hard to create like open society again. And I believe like corruption and things also relates closely to this kind of double think or double life, like way of life. And about the Hitler Jugend, I think Jun Army and these organizations are more close to Hitler Jugend than Komsomol. And the gender is one thing, which is very similar to Hitler Jugend. And like Komsomol educated children to be very like non-binary citizens. And also the role of the religion. So I think there's most similar things with Hitler Jugend. But like after the Hitler Jugend, these young people, most of them very changed or turned their jackets, to say very quickly. But there are some studies that children who were maybe from 5 to 10 years when they received very harsh indoctrination in Germany, so they were hurt and had real difficulties to adapt a new society and ideologies. Thanks.
Right, thank you, Jonna.
Thank you.
Once more. Right. And our third speaker is Laura Solanko. And I briefly introduce her to you, although I think that almost everybody here knows you, Laura, already. So Laura Solanko is a senior advisor at Profit Bank of Finland. Her areas of responsibility are especially Russian economics, banking sector, and energy markets. Her academic research focuses on political cycles in private bank lending and the effects of sanctions. Laura Solanko has a PhD in economics. She has published, for example, in Journal of Comparative Economics and Post-Soviet Affairs. Laura, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So, very good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to discuss something which may, at least to some of you, sound a little bit exotic. So I'm clearly an economist, mainly doing or I would say in the peacetime I used to do empirical microeconomic research. Now then, for the past 3 years, I think all of us have been engaged in all sorts of other types of analysis as well. But what I'm going to discuss with you is sort of a very tiny look into what potentially sort of some economic time series could tell us about Russia's mobilization efforts. So that's and I'll sort of walk you through also, in a way, wishing to introduce what is possible and what is not possible on doing that. Pardon me, there we go. So the background, the motivation for looking at this issue is something that already has been widely discussed also here today, and I assume yesterday as well, that for Russia, recruiting new soldiers is apparently increasingly difficult. There is clearly a clear unwillingness to go for an open mobilization, and instead new recruits are attracted by increasing monetary bonuses and sign-up bonuses and increasing salaries and special compensations on various issues, and which at least that tells to an outside observer that there's no grand nationalistic euphoria among large shares of the population in Russia. But and therefore other means other means have been used to increase men in the arms. One background to this difficulty is that on top of the acute war, Russia is facing demographic decline. It's especially the cohorts of people, or especially men in this case, from 20 to 40, that are actually, the numbers are declining. The picture here, in case it's visible for you, is from Rosstat population forecast, the median variant. So not the bad, not the good, but the median forecast, and going forward, the trends continue. But looking back or looking at the current outcome, only the youngest cohorts will increase, and the 25 to 45 cohorts are declining. The cohort of 20-year-old males in 2023 was 780,000 persons, and that's smaller than it has been for a while. Of course, still, as you may see, the numbers are huge. We're still talking about tens of millions, but the trend is declining. And Opslan, I'm sorry for you. There's supposed to be a picture there. You need to use your imagination now. So the problem is not lack of young men per se, but it's a serious labor shortage in the economy overall due to the decline in working age population. And during these last 3 years, the decline in net immigration. There's more people leaving the country and somewhat less people coming in. And then there's the economic boom that's created by the increasing government expenditure, which then increases demand for labor. The picture that was supposed to be here would show you the unemployment rate and also the employment rate. So giving an idea that unemployment rate is at historically low levels. So by all practical measures, there's full employment in Russia. And from the point of view of Russian economy, the tragedy is that those who still are unemployed mostly live in North Caucasus republics. And that's a pool of labor force that's probably somewhat unlikely to move to the industrial centers of central Russia. So So that's sort of, this is the background making the mobilization effort so very difficult. And now then, certainly, simply to better understand the limits, it might be helpful to understand a bit more on who are those new soldiers, who are those who are accredited, and where do they come from. And as you all know, we do have various sources tracking especially the number of killed in action across Russia, mainly all of them based on various social media posts. But the limitation then, of course, is that these only focus on those killed, not on those recruited. No, then this is unfortunate, since sort of part of my story is missing, but I don't know what to do at this point. But you now then you need to imagine a map of Russia with various Russian regions in there. The map is taken from one of the few studies that's published in an academic referee journal by Savina and Bonch-Aslamovskaya that came out already in 22, where they used the information on, for the first 2 months of the first round of mobilization, there was some visibility into the fiscal data at the federal level on the payments going to regions. And based on that very, very short data period, these researchers sort of made a regional map with lots of holes, but at least sort of highlighting a few regions that are really red in the corners of Russia that you now then only need to imagine on where they potentially were. And my question was that, hey, do we have another way of trying to track on where those monies go? I mean, where if the fiscal data is no longer available, is something else available? Can we somehow track? Now, we don't know what are the payments that arrive at regional budgets, but where do those monies go after they arrive on regional budgets? Well, most probably they go to bank accounts of those mobilized or their families. And since Russia is a bank-based society in many ways, and also already several years before the war, all government payments and social payments had to be paid on a bank account that's linked to a MIR card. So we can assume that, at least practically taken, all bonuses and salaries are in fact paid to bank accounts of those sort of mobilized or recruited. And therefore, one could think that should potentially be reflected in household deposits and household funds in the banking sector. At least initially those should show up. Now then, these two pictures show the national figure at the Russia-wide development of household deposit at banks, the stock, and then the line is the growth rate. It feels fairly natural that when there is an economic boom, there is also increase in bank deposits, and that's what we say. In economics literature, we typically think that socioeconomic factors like disposable income do shape bank deposits, but also the deposits or saving is shaped by sort of precautionary savings and changes in security or changes in consumption opportunities and all that. So we really don't know for sure what's going on. But on average, since 23, household deposits have been growing much faster than wages have been growing. So either there's some other income sources have started to increase very fast, or then consumption opportunities have changed dramatically, or maybe both. But then, sort of going one step further, no, then I'm really somehow my own handouts and the slides don't quite coincide, but we'll try to manage. Don't worry. Good grief. Okay, let's go back to this figure showing how bank deposits have changed. Well, exactly a similar picture emerges when looking at regional data. So on average, what happens at the regional level. So Central Bank of Russia still continues to publish data on stocks of bank deposits at regional level, household deposits and corporate deposits separately. So we can download the data on household deposits by region at monthly level. And then looking if that could help us telling a bit more of a story. And now I'm really sort of, this is an interesting journey. I don't know what comes up next, but I really apologize. It must be my mistake. No worries. The first observation while looking at the regional data is that there's huge regional variation. That's true always across Russia and always across almost any economic metric across the regions. But also looking at household deposits and especially the growth in household deposits. There is huge variation in there. And also the variation has clearly increased, sort of comparing the pre-war and after-war variation, regional variation in the monthly deposits, sort of the standard deviation almost doubles. So increasingly there's something is happening across regions. Some regions clearly do stand out on deposit growth. And no, we do have a picture, which is fortunate, fortunate for I guess everyone. To give an example, this picture shows you the growth in household deposits overall, which is the blue line. It's the Russian average. There has been a huge increase in the growth rate, you see. The blue line starts to increase rapidly at around early 23. But then there is a group of regions where the growth in deposits occurs earlier and it's much, much faster. And as an example of this group, this graph shows you the change in household deposits in Tuva Republic. That's sort of a, and then there is and why I'm talking about year-on-year annual changes is that monthly variation is always very huge. So it's difficult. The similar trends do show up also if looking at monthly changes, but there's so much volatility that the annual changes are somewhat sort of give a nicer picture. There is a group of 10 to 15 regions where the growth rates suddenly jump in at around August 23, annual change. So change from September 22 to August 23 and going forward. It's a group of 10 to 15 regions where really stand out in this data. Now then, I'm really, my apologies. It's something has really happened, which is, I guess I'll stop with the slides here and just try to walk you through the story. I'm happy to share the corrected slides with anyone who's interested in. Okay, so to cut short, make a grouping of regions where deposit growth started earlier, and it's really markedly higher than anywhere else, about 15 regions. And those pre-war, those regions on average do not differ from the national average. Deposit growth, wage growth, growth in industrial production. I mean, that seems to say there seems to be a common trend. But after summer 22, something really happens, and especially those regions experience a very high growth in deposits and not a sort of very, very moderate growth in wages. And running a simple regression explaining increase in deposits by regional average wage, changes in regional retail trade, in changes in regional industrial production. The regression results produce sort of a sensible results for all regions before the war and rather sensible results for the rest of the regions also during the wartime. But for this group of about 15 regions, the results really turn insignificant, and actually the correlation between wages and deposits turn negative in 23 for this group of regions. So sort of going through the regional level data seems to indicate that something a bit unusual is taking place in those regions. And now then, maybe looking at the list of names in here may tell you something, or if we now could compare the maps on information on where the mobilization effort was strongest initially, and the map showing those regions, they actually do coincide in a fairly nice way. So the data seems to suggest that sort of looking at funny little things like regional banking sector data may actually give us some additional indications on where the action really is. And that's sort of actually the limits of what we really can do. I cannot share you with any definitive, conclusive evidence, but there's sort of a seems to suggest. Now then, the final complication is that the data is still updated and it's still available. And I really also thought that I would update the regression analysis until the end of last year. But then a few weeks back, when I uploaded the data from Russian Central Bank, I realized that it's different from what I had previously. So no, there's no clear reason or no clear pattern on how it's different. So I'm a little bit stuck right now on trying to figure out what is the correct data and what is not. So there may be an additional difficulty in sort of using this sort of methods going forward. But we'll keep on trying. And I think that's where I'll end. Thank you very much, and once again, apologies for the mess with the slides.
Thank you, Laura. We have 5 minutes for questions. You will be staying with us for the panel also, but if you have any quick ones, there are 2 on the back.
Thank you, Laura, and also to other presenters. I don't know if Jonna is still in the room, but I was interested in the question, like after hearing the presentation on the UNArmia, and now Laura, your presentation. And this might be difficult to answer, but like, is there any correlation, like these people from the regions, are they ones who possibly have been participating to UNArmia activities before going to the war and dying there or fighting there, or are these like 2 separate groups, like the UNArmia being more like for the ethnic Russians, like this kind of patriotic organization, and then the dying being done more by the minorities and those who are not actually part of this patriotic education? Just maybe your opinion on this. Thank you.
Okay, and there was another question also back there. Was there? No. Yes.
Thank you very much. Related to this increase of deposits, I just appreciate your clarification. This increase is related to the increase of number of soldiers signing contracts or increase of sums of the bonuses being paid. Because as we know, since that time, the bonuses increased drastically from 140,000 up to a couple of millions in certain regions. So I would appreciate clarification. And one more question, I hope you did that research, but it was also a very interesting phenomenon in the Russian war when we started to recruit prisoners. And I came across a couple of articles in open sources arguing that the financial burden, especially recruiting prisoners for the private military companies, was different compared to what they are having right now when the prisoners are being recruited through the normal Ministry of Defense line. So if you can, I would appreciate your elaboration on that. Thank you.
Okay. Let's go with that.
Yeah, hey, thank you. Wonderful question about, I don't know, do we have regional data on UNArmia sort of activities? We should have. So combining that would really be a good idea. I don't know the answer, but it's an excellent question. Thank you for pointing it out. I don't know about ethnicity per se, but of course, sort of what we know from open source is that quite a share of those recruited to the military are of the older generation, how to put it kindly. But yes, that's a good idea. That should be checked. And then on clearly there's no way to differentiate between the source of the payments. We only can observe that household deposits have increased in regions in a time when average wages did not. that's sort of a so there's clearly no, I mean, no direct evidence. It's an indicative evidence of something going on in those regions, and I just failed to find another explanation. There may be one, and I would be happy to hear your suggestions on what else might be going on in those regions apart from sort of additional salaries, additional bonuses starting to emerge in bank accounts of both those recruited and then compensations to the bank accounts of the family members.
All right. Thank you, Laura. And so time's up. Next we have coffee, and we'll be back here for the final session at 2 o'clock sharp. Please enjoy. to take your seats. So we're waiting for our panelists. Anyone who feels in or his or her heart the feel to come and take part in our panel, please welcome. There are 3 seats. So could I please ask the panelists to come sit here in the front? Okay, let's start. So good afternoon, everybody, sir. Welcome to this last session of this year's Russia seminar. This is going to be a panel discussion with an array of distinguished panelists debating on Russia's future prospects, resources, and status. I am who I am. And with me is Katri Pynnöniemi, and we are together moderating this panel discussion. And this panel discussion will take 45 minutes. So we'll be ending 2:45 sharp, because then we are going to hear closing remarks from the Vice Rector of Finnish National Defense University. All the panelists, I think, have already given presentations during these 2 days, so I will not spend too much time introducing them, but just to check that we have everybody present. So online we have Dr. Finel, who is on the screen there. Then we have Sarah Massa-Feinberg from Tel Aviv, Céline Marange from Paris. And do we have Julian Gordon? Yes, excellent. Center of Naval Analysis, United States. Tobias Kolakowski is not present. And then Oona-Maria from our house, so to speak. Margareta Klein from Germany. And then Jonna is not with us, and then Ika Korhonen, Pofit Finland. So everybody got mentioned? Excellent. All right, so during these 2 days we have heard many interesting and thought-provoking presentations on Russia and its war against Ukraine. In this panel, we try to still dig a little bit deeper, debating based on the research we have been presented, following issues. Can we agree on Russia's future prospects or not? What are the most important unknowns and uncertainties? And in what should we focus our research in the near future? This is, of course, a complex issue ranging from politics to economy to culture and so forth, but in this panel, let's try to zoom on military issues. With that, I would like each of our panelists reflect on the saying, which is familiar to all of us: Russia is never as strong as she looks. Russia is never as weak as she looks. But let us twist this saying a little bit. So could I ask our panelists to reflect on what are the Russian strengths we do not see, and what are the weaknesses we do not see? And let's start with Dr. Finel. Please, sir, as soon as you are ready.
Okay, that's a great deal to think about. So what are Russian strengths that we don't see? I think what's interesting about Russia is that it's how there's not as much of a gap as one would expect after a relatively devastating 3 years of fruitless conflict, with relatively little to show for it. It's impressive to me that there are so few sort of visible cracks in public opinion, in the ability of Russia to recruit, in responses to higher inflation. I guess that's what surprises me the most. You think that just in general, right, a regime which is lacking in some fundamental democratic legitimacy embarks on a 3-year war, which has gained relatively little, which has cost tremendous number of lives, and which seems nonetheless to be quite solid. Now, that's a big assumption, I think, ultimately, because that gets to this issue of what we don't see. And this is of course the problem, right? We just don't have, I think, a wonderfully rich or nuanced sense about, and here particularly I'm not talking about sort of public opinion broadly, but about whether there are any empowered actors out there who may be thinking about change, resistance, a post-Putin era, and how they're maneuvering behind the scenes. Everything still seems, at least as far as I can tell, and I'm not going to claim to be a super Russia expert, but when we saw the Wagner coup attempt, and it fell apart so quickly, that it raises interesting questions about whether there is something sort of more fundamental than a transactional connection between Putin and his empowered elites, and more than a repressive connection between Putin and the broader population. And I guess, at least for me, that's where I have trouble really gauging a sense of his level of support, the level of support for Putinism more broadly, the level of support that a successor might have, and therefore, what are the dynamics which are going on perhaps behind the scenes, because there have to be people talking amongst themselves, but what are they saying, what are they thinking, what are they planning? And I guess that's where my mysteries come in. And I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Finel, and let's go from my left to right. So, Margaret, please.
Thank you very much. What are the strengths that we do not see? I mean, most we see, but maybe not in the dimension they have. The one is the ability for the society to take losses, both on the human level and on the economic level. This is due to a kind of dominance of the information space, but also apathy of the society, which is a strength for the regime, but of course a weakness of society. And it's an adapting toolbox where Russia can use tools that we do not be able to use. That is a strength. When it comes to the weaknesses, with regard to the military, I think it's a concentration on mass versus professionalization. So in the future, it will be a task for Russia to continue the effort that have been taken place before to professionalize the armed forces. Then it's the proxification of the divergent structures of violence in a situation where they are not needed on the battlefield anymore. So how to integrate them? What about the sponsors? Then it is about decision making, where we have seen that the Russian regime is not very good when it comes to quickly react in crisis situations. We have seen that with regard to the Prigozhin mutiny, but also when it comes to the Kursk offensive. So a decision-making process where people beyond the upper level usually don't take the initiative. This is a situation where nothing happens for a moment. So this is a very risk-averse attitude of the lower level and mid-level decision makers. And then the big question for me is how far is regime stability connected with the war? Because we have seen that on different dimensions within our seminar. So economy and war closely interrelated. People tend to get benefits, recruitment bonus, working in the military-industrial complex. So what if the war stops? Then when it comes to society and military, so patriotic education and mobilization, then when it comes to regime legitimacy, so selling something as a success story, yes, that's possible, but what when the war ends? What would be the next narrative? So these issues I'd like to highlight. Thank you.
I assume I am the next. Thank you, Margarete. I am very much trying to continue from that, since we are somehow involved in researching the exactly same field. So I think that especially this war has highlighted that, I would say that this is, the main strength is the durability, the resource durability, and did you said the kind of durability into take on all of these losses. And I think that, because I focused on the challenges yesterday in my speech, and I figured that despite these challenges, the Russian military has never been in the verge of actual collapse. So it might have been that when I'm focusing on challenges, I think that the army is somehow in the verge of collapse. It has never, it is not. And even in the years of like the 90s, when we consider the years of decay of the Russian military, it still did its tasks. It was always able to kind of do its task. So I think that that is one of those like strengths of Russian military, but it might turn into weakness if also Russia kind of counts on the fact that we have unlimited resources, because at some day the resources might become limited. So maybe that's at this moment it seems like that's the main strength, but I still do believe that there comes the day when the resources kind of end, so the main strength can become the main weakness.
Okay, thank you. I think I'll pick up on that. And yes, one of the strengths is that Russia has resources. It has its own resources. It has access to resources from other countries via foreign trade, but those are still finite. And I think one particular source of resources, mainly old savings, whether they're in form of cash in the National Welfare Fund or in form of hardware from Soviet times, they are very close or have been very soon they will be depleted. So that's one strength that will soon turn to weakness. But one of the strengths has been clearly that the Russian economy, Russian market economy, Russian companies have been able to adjust fairly quickly. And I think that's the lesson for basically at least all economists who are looking at sanctions and the effects of sanctions, that the economies do adjust. I mean, the new equilibrium will be less efficient, worse than the previous one, but clearly Russian economy has been able to continue working. Then on the weaknesses, I mean, there are obviously links or limits to the adjustment, just as there are limits to the old savings that are now being depleted. If we are in a situation where Russia is out of global value chains, production networks, and actually much of the scientific cooperation of Russian academia has ceased to exist in all sciences, it's hard for me to see how Russia could hope to innovate even in a fairly narrow fields, I mean, going forward. I mean, there's some cooperation obviously with China, but even there the Chinese partners are quite cautious. I think if you look next 3 to 5 years, that's one of the biggest weaknesses of Russian society. And then my final point, basically there's no, I mean, if we ask Russians, you know, we support the war and so on, but nobody really wants to make any personal sacrifices for Russia, or at least not for Putin. I mean, the precaution is, the whole spectacle was a great example of that. And of course, the fact that you have to keep increasing the sign-up bonuses to get people to the military. I mean, that tells you that people might be vocal about their support, but they don't want to make any personal sacrifices. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay. Great. So I'll take this in 3 parts. First, the sort of where Russia is stronger than some of us might expect or perhaps desire normatively, where Russia is weaker, and then I'll give you something a little more crunchy on the what should we focus on, because we haven't hit that as much in the military sort of sense of things for researchers like ourselves. So in terms of where Russia is stronger, I mean, I can riff on my presentation that I gave earlier today, is that the regime is surprisingly resilient, surprisingly flexible. It doesn't do a great job on the first time. It's not efficient. It's slow to learn, but it does learn. It does overcome various challenges, at least over the last 3 years. And this is a regime that's lasted for 25 years. Across a variety of political challenges, economic challenges, sanctions challenges, and so on. So there's no reason why we should have a baseline of collapse anytime soon. We should have a baseline of resilience. And maybe we'll get surprised. Maybe it collapses tomorrow. Something crazy happens in the Kremlin. But we shouldn't assume it. We should assume the opposite. So I think Russia is just, in general, stronger. It's more flexible. It doesn't look like it is, but the empirical evidence is unambiguous, because it is. It's still here. And it's still fighting this war. Where Russia is weaker, I will piggyback on a previous comment about much of the Russian elite is unused and untrained in energetic activity. It's a relatively lazy, reactive elite. There is a lot of disincentives for autonomous action, in part because personal ambition is not rewarded among the political elite. With some exceptions, and there are very critical exceptions, and those are the people we need to pay attention to, but in general, with the closing off of pluralist politics, the closing off of semi-competitive gubernatorial elections, the closing off of the Duma as a place where you can sort of make your name as an ambitious politician, it makes it more difficult to cultivate incentives for ambitious Russians to rise in the ranks, right? Instead, they're rising up through bureaucratic mechanisms, they're rising up through loyalism, and that's not fully uniform, right? So Prigozhin is actually perhaps the most important example of the self-made man in this system. But we can also think of close Putin allies such as Nikolai Patrushev. We can think of the rising generation that's being talked a lot about. So Duman, for example, Patrushev's son, Putin's niece, all of which have been given a lot of recent discussion. I know it's weird to say, but actually in the Russian parliament, which is a subordinate political institution, there are ambitious parliamentarians. They usually run various committees and they actually engage in lawmaking. It's not oppositional lawmaking, but they do care and they do influence things. So there are a few places. But in general, it's a system that does not reward ambition and certainly not open ambition. And that's a huge problem, especially as succession draws near. And finally, I'll do the sort of the military, what should we focus on? And I think there is tremendous alpha in looking as closely as we can with the public observables that we have available on the internal workings of the Ministry of Defense bureaucracy. Everything that can be looked at, every document that exists, every personnel change, every career change that takes place, who is running X department, who is running Y department, what are they producing, throw every single piece of paper that the MOD produces that is on the internet, throw it into a large language model, see what we get, because the MOD bureaucracy is now running a significant part of the Russian economy. It's massively influential for wartime decision-making at the operational level. We need to know who's doing that. And finally, we need to know about cadre promotion dynamics. What is the new military bureaucratic elite? Who do they look like? What are the selection effects? Are they people with combat experience? Are they people with operational command? Or is it clans based around sort of particular figures in Moscow? One of the major criticisms of Shoigu was that he had this clan of deputy ministers who didn't actually have military experience, or not really. They had bureaucratic experience. They were very good at pushing paper. And so is that changing? Where is that changing? Why or why not? It's going to tell us a lot about Russia in the future. And I think that's a huge area of research that we need to dive in as much as possible. That's all for me.
I would like to zoom out a little bit and go beyond Russia. Russia on the global stage in terms of Russia's strengths. I think that one of the major strengths of Russia has been able to secure, against all odds, a continuous support or continuous popularity in the global south. And I think this was a major shock for most of us as researchers of Russia. And in particular, Russia's ability to destabilize parallel fronts through the Ukrainian front. And especially I would like to talk about the Middle East. The ways in which Russia's it was the same during Crimea and Syria. We had this on steroids in 2022. The ways in which Russia was able to interconnect the Ukrainian front with the Middle Eastern front, sort of drawing a connection between Ukraine and its power projection in Syria, is quite remarkable, and using it as a tool, as a card, a bargaining card against vis-à-vis the West, is one of the major Russian strengths. Another thing that should be mentioned is the pervasive nature of Russia's security alignments. We've seen with the war in Ukraine an acceleration and a deepening of Russia's security alignment with China, but mostly with North Korea and Iran, of course, on different degrees. With North Korea, there is a mutual defense clause, which is not the case with Iran. But what is amazing is Russia's ability to develop security alignments that go beyond purely transactional considerations, but that still remain below the threshold of an alliance. And it gives Russia a lot of flexibility in advancing its own security interests by playing with those actors. Another major strength, and we've talked a lot during this amazing conference about data, about what is visible and not visible. And I would like to make 2 points about non-visible strengths. The first one is knowledge diffusion. The war in Ukraine has been a formidable laboratory of knowledge diffusion in military technology, Russia, Iran, Russia, North Korea, in different domains, in dual use, but also in the nuclear domain. I mean, speaking from a Middle Eastern point of view, it is well known that Russia has less self-restriction regarding cooperation with Iran. And there's a lot of stuff, I'm sorry for being blunt, but that passes on from experts to experts on the civilian level. But that does have long-term strategic repercussions. And I think this is one aspect that is not visible, that is not quantifiable, that is below the radar, but that has huge consequences. The second one is wartime learning. Russians are fast learners, fast adaptators, and I think this is an area of the rhythm and the quality of the adaptation during that war is remarkable and needs to be deepened in terms of, the research needs to be deepened. In terms of weaknesses, there are 2 points that I have in mind. The first one is Russia's inability to secure its strategic foothold in Eurasia. Against all odds, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Armenia are not big Russian lovers. And I think that in the long term, this will deprive Russia of a strategic hold that was so important to its power projection. And I think this is an incremental weakness in the making that we're seeing. And the last weakness or blind spot, we've talked a lot about ideological indoctrination, covert mobilization about Russian society. But if we look back at history, and I think that there are older Russian experts in that room, there was one common denominator among political dissidents or Russian experts, is that nobody saw the Soviet Union collapsing. The only one who saw that was Amalrik. And I think that there are low-key signs that we're not deciphering in Russian society, and that should be studied better in order to understand the real societal dynamics and the hearts and minds of the Russian population.
I would say that one of Russia's main strengths is its ability to use information warfare and subversion activities to weaken the West. I think they have been doing that for more than a century. It is integrated in their military planning and in their strategic coercion effort that is constant. And so I think that we should take seriously the fact that the political weakening of our societies is part of the plan. That they are, and they are quite open about that. I mean, they write it in their military sort of articles. They don't hide it, and they invest a lot of resources to win this war of perceptions that is also, in a sense, a war of attrition, and I'm afraid that we could lose this war of attrition. And they so far they have had quite impressive results. I mean, they were able to shape the debate on the war in Ukraine and on the geopolitical confrontation in the rest of the world. And also, they were able to present the West as a neo-colonial power in many countries in Africa and in Asia, in South America, while waging a colonial war in Ukraine. I mean, it's, when you think about that, it's, and they also demonstrated their ability to sow confusion about their war aims and the end goal of their grand strategies within our societies and our leaderships by using double language. I mean, it seems to me that everyone plays a role. Someone will have to use very radical rhetoric, while another one, and especially Vladimir Putin, will pretend to be moderate. And I think that it seems to me that they do it on purpose, and that those discordant voices are just staged. And so I think that we should pay attention, on this. We should pay attention on their ability to wage this war of this information war. And about Russia's weaknesses that we do not see, well, a lot have been said. I would add that it seems to me that they're radicalized in such a way since the full-scale invasion that it will be difficult for the regime to stop the war. Because, the transformations that have been undertaken since the full-scale invasion have already huge consequences. So the new social contract and the economic growth depend on the continuation of the war. And I think that we should bear it in mind now, especially now. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. Does any of the panelists want to comment on anything somebody else said? Nope. All agreed? Okay.
Well, perhaps on the last point about the sort of being unable to stop the war. I mean, we have been talking about this with colleagues. I mean, what would happen to Russian economy if the war ended? That's an interesting question. I mean, in principle, also before the war, they could have spent much more public money and increased people's welfare. They chose not to do that. They were very prudent. Now for 3 years, the spigots have been opened. Are they able to sort of stop that and start saving or reorient the spending to something that is more sort of welfare enhancing? I'm not sure. Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And whatever happens, I think that will have some cracks will begin to appear. I mean, even at least within the elite, but also in the society more broadly. Yeah, thanks.
I'll jump on the global South question and Russia's general success, and we shouldn't overstate it. BRICS is still mostly just a little club, but it is 100% true that, broadly speaking, Russia has successfully pivoted in terms of foreign policy, but it's also successfully pivoted in the narrative or the ideology or the self-promotion of what is Russia. That aligns quite well with the sort of broader global South identity, this sort of civilizationist, liberal kind of orientation. I always think about Vladimir Putin gave a speech last year, I think, at the World Russian People's Congress or something like that. And if you read it, half of it reads like imperial nationalism sort of rhetoric, and half of it reads like something taken out of a left progressive critical theory workshop. And I'm being very, very serious here, right? If I didn't tell my students that Vladimir Putin had written this, they would be very confused. And it's very clear, like the language of anti-imperialism, and it's not just riffing on the old Soviet language of anti-imperialism, that's there too, but it's also sort of like modern variants on it, the stuff that you hear in classrooms today, the stuff that there's an ongoing reaction in the United States against, right? So this is part of it, and Putin's nailed it. He's figured it out. It's the same reason why he loves to rant about cancel culture, right? Like he clearly is viewing the world, is discontented with it, and he has an answer. And the answer is Russia is its own civilization. The vision of the future is traditional, but not like Amish traditional. It's just not what the West is putting together, which has had its own radical ideological changes. This multipolarity argument fits in very well. It fits in with arguments taking place in China or in India or elsewhere. And I think that the point I really want to make is that sometimes people make the claim that Russia has no vision of the future, or it's sort of a dead country, or necropolitics, things like that. And the Russians are depressed and they're demoralized and they've mortgaged their future and all of that. And in some ways that might be true, but in other ways, I actually think the regime has successfully made the case to its own population as this is how you should think about the world. This is how you should think about us. We fit in this patchwork of civilization states. We fit in this patchwork against the hegemony of the West, of liberalism, or whatever you want to call it. And I think that's not incongruent with the average Russian's general views on society. And I actually think that is the vision of the future. And that's what they've been pushing. That's what they've been adding to the official ideological content, the educational content. And I don't think that's going to fully fail. I actually think it's going to more or less succeed.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Finale.
Let me just add just one quick point on that. We focus a lot on what Russia's doing and Russian narratives and so on. And we also have to look into our own societies and look at the vulnerabilities and weaknesses that they exploit. And look, I mean, it's a reality that I bet that everyone in the room right now comes from a country where the population birth rate is below the replacement level. That says something about our own society's view of the future, where we live in societies where many of our children will have lives that are less promising in some ways than our own because of deindustrialization, all the ravages of a variety of neoliberal economic models. And so they're pushing a little bit on an open door. And so we shouldn't give them too much credit for having a clever ideology, as much as we should also recognize that there's a lot of discontent based on decisions that we've made over 30 and 40 years, which are coming back to roost in various ways.
Okay, thank you. Anything else from the panel? Okay. Ona.
Yeah, I was thinking of maybe adding very, very quickly. Thank you for excellent comments. And I think we have to remember that at least a potential strength is the fact that the Russian military, alongside with the Ukrainian army, is now one of the most combat experienced armies in the world, at least in warfare of this scale. And that is a potential strength and a potential threat if this experience can be transformed into actual lessons learned. But then again, it might be experience wasted if not so. Quick add.
Okay, thank you. Time flies. 7 minutes left. So I would like to open the floor for questions from the audience, at least a couple of ones if you have any. Okay, there's one.
Gene Germanovich from NATO. Wondering if war termination is sort of not on the horizon, any thoughts about implications of ceasefire or Russian thinking during what might be a pause for months or for a little bit longer, either from a military or from an economic perspective? Thank you.
Okay, let's take a quick round through the table, about 1 minute per person to answer that question, and we start with Dr. Finale.
It's hard to say. Clearly, any ceasefire or pause, I think, buys time for the Russians and hurts the Ukrainians, because I think it's more likely to undermine long-term external support for Ukraine. And so I'd imagine that the Russians would look at any time as a good opportunity to reconstitute forces and just plan to be relaunching operations in the future at an opportune moment. So I don't know. I don't have much of an answer on that, honestly.
Okay, then thank you. Margaret.
Thank you. So if you just think about a scenario where the war is not ending, but we have some kind of ceasefire, maybe not stable, but still we see that there is a clear connection between Russia's war against Ukraine and the long-term confrontation with the West. So given a situation where Russia doesn't have to focus too much now on Ukraine, it will redirect probably its efforts to the long-term confrontation with the West. Even more since we have that new setting where the role of the US is getting a bit blurred with regard to Europe. So there is a window of opportunity to push through a bit more with regard to hybrid threats, cognitive warfare, and the threat to escalate, for example. And this is even more probable since the war and the confrontation with the West is closely interacted with Russia's regime stability on different levels. So it's not easy for the regime to just push back everything that it has done in the war. For example, with regard to the economy, where the growth is much driven by military-industrial complex, where regime legitimacy is somehow driven by the idea of Russia's strengths and the projection of power, so it has to do somewhere. So I would argue that we will see much more a prolongation of the long war with a concentration on the European theater. And here Russia puts into a situation where European weakness is very strong and where it's easy to exploit and gain get gains.
Well, very quickly about ceasefire implications. Well, there are sociological questionnaires. I know that the results must be taken with a pinch of salt, but there are at least some indications that there would be some kind of, there's indications that the Russians are kind of leaning towards being for some kind of ceasefire or negotiations, but of course everything depends on the conditions of the ceasefire. So I'm trying to think that if the ceasefire would nevertheless end in such conditions that Russia would still remain isolated, there wouldn't be any sanction relieving, what would that do for the society? Yes, it might buy time for the war economy and for the military to kind of resource up, but then again, if you look at from the societal point of view, I'm kind of thinking that is there anything in that?
If there would be a ceasefire of, I don't know, 6 months or something, I'm fairly certain that the production in the war-related industries would continue as it now is. Russia would use the time to replenish the stocks they have been using. There would be less pressure on direct sort of war-related costs, because you don't have to pay so many people who are in the front, you don't have to pay sign-on bonuses and so on. So they would use this money basically to rearm and be ready for the round two. Thanks.
Okay, so one answer that doesn't answer your question, which is, but I bring it up because I think it's interesting. Since we're now going to be going into negotiations, I think something for all of us to be looking at is, does the Russian armed forces accelerate their tactical and operational activities, or do they slow them down? Because that's going to be decisions made in the Kremlin in the negotiation. And the admin might take that well or take that poorly, depending on how it goes. So I think that's just something to look at, like a very immediate thing right now. We should be paying close attention to tempo. An answer that gets a little bit closer to what you're saying, if it's just a ceasefire, like a couple of months, that's actually kind of a really terrible situation, because or like a couple months, half a year or something like that, because the Ukrainian economy is not going to be able to be rebuilt. There's not going to be any future investment because the war is just postponed. Everyone knows that conflict is going to start up again. You're going to have full mobilization along the line of contact. That's actually very bad. And we're in an era where we're in a scenario where there's no good options. But that's actually a really bad one. We'd much prefer like a couple years, maybe a North Korea ceasefire, DMZ situation, even if it breaks down. And I think we should take seriously the fact that even if we have a successful deal, that there's another war in 5 years or so. And we should just keep that in mind. Sorry to be, pessimistic about things.
Yeah, maybe another thing I would like to add to the previous points is that should there be a ceasefire, one should expect the full activation of Russia's non-kinetic measures on steroids, being and taking in consideration that those non-kinetic measures are much more sophisticated than they were from 2014 to 2022. And we know that in the Russian new generation warfare approach or doctrine, a peace negotiation or some kind of agreement has to go hand in hand with the application of an incremental pressure on the adversary. And in that case, one should expect, the whole variety, the whole spectrum of pressure in the informational, cyber, disruption activities, and so on. Because Russia will want to secure, entering some kind of negotiation from a position of strength and adjusting, calibrating the pressure according to the phase of negotiation. So this is something to be prepared to, including in the realm of civil aviation, the whole spectrum that we got accustomed to.
I completely agree with what Sarah has just said. I think that if there is a ceasefire, they will intensify hybrid activities in Ukraine and in Europe, and especially they will exploit the political divisions that will result from the concession that the Ukrainian leadership may have to accept. And the end goal, I think, in Ukraine is the subjugation of Ukraine, and so they will do their best to obtain capitulation. So I don't think they will stop. If I may add just a point, the conference deals with the war in Ukraine, the lessons that we can draw, and the trends that we can observe. And what struck me is that the focus of most presentations has been on Russia almost entirely, except for a few talks by Mark and Kristen, for instance, about the transformation of the defense industrial base. And I think there are good reasons to worry about Russia. So there is a rationale in putting the emphasis on Russia's capability to sustain its military effort and to realize its reconstitution within, in the coming years. However, it seems to me that the invisibility of Ukraine, even among expert communities, is playing in Russia's hand, and it hampers our strategic planning and our ability to shape a robust decision-making process about the future of Ukraine. And so we know that there is already a lack of expertise about Ukraine in Europe. And so I think it's especially important to continue to study technological innovation in Ukraine, military and economic adaptation during the war, civil-military relations in Ukraine, and also the civil society involvement in the war efforts. Because it's very important to make sure that Ukraine is not deprived of its agency again. And in a sense, it is also our responsibility to make sure that this does not happen.
Okay, thank you. I think we could have continued this for another 45 minutes easily, but unfortunately we are out of time. Thank you for all the panelists for providing us so much food for thought and future research ideas. And I hope I see you next year in here. So join me in thanking panelists. And with that, we shall continue to the last phase of this event. So next, Vice Rector of Finnish National Defense University, Colonel Pasi Hirvonen, will give his closing remarks. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Juha. Sir, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the panelists for the discussion, and thank you all for these 2 days of seminar. A year ago, when I started my closing remarks in last year's seminar, I started that by saying that we live in times of peril. In February 2024, the latest phase of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine had lasted for a few months. Now, a year later, that same phase, the war of attrition, is still ongoing. So from that perspective, much hasn't changed during a year. Yesterday, however, the world was giving lessons of geopolitics or great power politics or realpolitik, pick the one you like. That may have not been that surprising, but still some observers already yesterday referred those as Munich II, with the difference that not even Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain gave up to Hitler's key demands before the negotiations. Without going that far, I just say that what seems to be the starting point for peace negotiations has very little to do with justice or fairness or reality in the battlefield. We Finns, unfortunately, have some experience of that. What makes it even more unfair from our perspective is that if NATO's door would be closed for good, it actually was the Ukrainians who kept the door open for us between 2022 and 2023 with their blood and sacrifices. Having said that, my conclusion is that the dangerous times will continue as far as we are able to see. And if that's the case, the understanding of the true nature of Russia will continue to be as important and relevant it has been throughout the war. That obviously emphasizes the importance and relevance of this community of interest and you as experts of Russia. On behalf of the Finnish National Defense University, I thank you all for your interest in our seminar, your participation, whether present or online, and wish those who have been here safe travels to your home destinations. But before I officially close the seminar, I would like to ask the Russia Research Group of the Department of Warfare and the NDU to come here in front of the audience, please. Oona, you too. Yeah. Please give the group a big hand, a job well done. Thank you. So no presents, but this year. So thank you all, I welcome you all to next year's seminar. The actual dates for next year's seminar are 11th and 12th of February. So if you are interested, please mark those dates into your calendars. Thank you all. 2025 Russia seminar is now officially closed.